The end may justify the means as long as there is something that justifies the end. Tonight, we explore the life of a man who lived by this philosophy, a man whose name became synonymous with revolution itself, Leon Trotsky. To some, he was a brilliant visionary, the true heir to Lenin. To others, he was a ruthless fanatic and an enemy of the people. He created the Red Army from nothing, turning panicking conscripts into a force that won against 14 foreign armies. At 38, he stood second only to Lenin. By 50, he was fleeing across continents, his children dead or dying, his supporters vanishing into Stalin's camps. The man he'd dismissed as a grey mediocrity had outmaneuvered him completely. Yet, from a fortified villa in Mexico City, he kept writing, kept fighting, and kept believing history would vindicate him. An assassin with an ice axe ended that hope in August 1940. Stalin's erasure, however, had already begun. Trotsky was scrubbed from photographs, then struck from books, until he was finally removed from memory itself. For decades in the Soviet Union, speaking his name meant arrest or worse. The revolution's architect had become its ghost. But before we dive deeper, I want to know what you think. Was Trotsky a tragic hero who fought for a better world, or was he simply a dangerous ideologue whose methods were just as ruthless as his rivals? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Oh, and if you're enjoying History After Dark, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps other sleepy souls find this content. Now, settle in as we begin to explore the life of the armed prophet who became an outcast and the man who was destroyed by the very world he helped create. This is the bedtime biography of Leon Trotsky. Chapter 1: The Steppe and the Spark. How does a boy become a revolutionary icon? Looking back, you might search for signs: the witnessed suffering of peasants, the books devoured in secret, the outsider status of a Jew in Tsarist Russia. But the truth is simpler and stranger. The boy who would become Leon Trotsky was born Lev Davidovich Bronstein on October 26, 1879, on a farm called Yarnovka in the southern Ukrainian steppe. His father, David Leontievich, couldn't read or write, but he could calculate grain prices in his head faster than most men could on paper. He'd broken away from the Jewish agricultural colonies to build his own estate, driving himself and his laborers through 16-hour days, thinking only of work and savings. His mother, Anna, came from different stock, urban, educated, able to read Russian novels by candlelight. She kept to the old religious customs, while her husband ignored them entirely. The boy grew up between these worlds, watching his father negotiate with the decaying Polish gentry who leased him their mortgaged lands, seeing the seasonal strikes when half-starved laborers demanded better wages, witnessing men stumble through the fields with night blindness from malnutrition. At 7, they sent him to a Jewish religious school in the nearby colony. He knew no Yiddish, understood nothing, was miserable. They brought him home. His real education began when his cousin Moise Spencer took him to Odessa, that cosmopolitan port where ships arrived from Constantinople and London, where the air itself seemed charged with possibility. The Spencer home was everything Yanovka wasn't. Journalists argued over tea, manuscripts covered every surface, and the smell of fresh printer's ink hung in the rooms like perfume. Here the country boy discovered Pushkin's verses, wept over Oliver Twist, secretly read Tolstoy's forbidden plays. He was being polished, transformed, prepared for something neither he nor his hosts could quite name. At St. Paul's Realschule, a German Lutheran school with Orthodox Russians, Catholics, and Jews all mixed together, he immediately shot to the top of his class. Not from love of learning, but from a fierce need to prove himself superior. He could achieve more than the others. He knew it with the certainty that would later carry him through revolutions. Through all these years, politics meant nothing to him. The revolutionary movement had gone underground after the Tsar's assassination in 1881. The Spencers' mild liberalism was too timid to catch fire in a boy who dealt only in extremes. When he left for Nikolaev at 17 to complete his education, he was brilliant, arrogant, and dreaming of pure mathematics. Young Bronstein wanted only to be right, to win every argument, to prove his superiority through sheer intellectual force. Revolution would simply become the ultimate argument, the final proof. But that transformation still lay ahead in a provincial town where a Czech gardener ran a discussion circle, the police considered the most dangerous address in southern Russia. Chapter 2. In Search of an Ideal. In 1896, 17-year-old Bronstein arrived in Nikolaev, a provincial town where the most exciting event was the weekly cattle market. He lodged with a family whose sons dabbled in socialist ideas. At first, he argued against them with all the smug conservatism of youth, defending the status quo. Socialism was utopian nonsense. Human nature was fixed. The poor would always be poor. He deployed these arguments like a prize fighter showing off his footwork. But something was shifting inside him. The socialist arguments kept returning to his thoughts at night. They had an internal logic he couldn't quite dismiss. Then one day, without warning, his defenses crumbled entirely. He embraced socialism with the fervor of a convert, stunning the very people who'd been trying to convince him. The boy who'd argued for tradition was suddenly the most radical voice in the room. He found his way to a discussion circle run by Franz Szwigowski, a Czech gardener whose cottage sat in an orchard outside town. The police files described it as a center of dangerous conspiracies. In reality, it was 6 or 7 young people drinking tea and arguing about the future. Here he met Alexandra Sokolovskaya, a young woman whose calm certainty infuriated him. She was a Marxist. He immediately positioned himself against her. The Narodnik tradition, with its romantic faith in the peasantry and heroic individuals, appealed to his theatrical nature. Marxism seemed dry, mechanical, reducing everything to economic forces. Night after night, they battled across Shvigovsky's wooden table. She questioned how any logical person could rest on vague, idealistic emotions. He mocked her for following that narrow, impractical foreign doctrine that turned humans into economic units. The arguments were intellectual, but the undercurrent was personal. On New Year's Eve, after hours of particularly vicious debate, something snapped. He stood up, trembling with rage, or perhaps something else, and shouted, "A curse upon all Marxists, and upon those who want to bring dryness and hardness into all the relations of life." She left town soon after, swearing never to speak to him again. But the seed was planted. Within months, he was reading Marx in secret, finding in those dense pages something that answered questions he hadn't known he was asking. By 1897, he and his friends had founded the South Russian Workers' Union. Using the pseudonym Lvov, he became its soul, writing leaflets on a primitive mimeograph machine, organizing meetings in workers' apartments, teaching literacy alongside revolution. The union grew to 200 members before the police swept in. January 18th, 98. Mass arrests. Trotsky spent months in solitary confinement in Kherson prison, a stone cell so cold that ice formed on the walls, with lice for company and watery soup for sustenance. They transferred him to Odessa, where he spent a year and a half reading the Bible in 4 languages and attempting a materialist history of Freemasonry. In 1900, they moved him to Moscow's transfer prison, where, in a ceremony between cells, he married Alexandra Sokolovskaya, the woman he'd once cursed for her dryness. Together, they were exiled to Siberia for 4 years. The curse had become a prophecy. Chapter 3. At the Door of History. Siberian exile was a university for revolutionaries. In the village of Ust-Kut, Trotsky brushed cockroaches off the pages of Das Kapital while he read. Later, in Verkholensk, he became the star writer for an Irkutsk newspaper under the name Antid Oto. His essays on Siberian life made him famous among revolutionaries across Russia and even the émigrés in Europe. Here, finally, he embraced Marxism fully, arguing for a centralized party in terms that would later echo in Lenin's own writings. But exile couldn't contain his ambition. His wife, Alexandra, seeing his restlessness, made an extraordinary sacrifice. "Stay," she urged him. "Leave us behind, her and their 2 infant daughters, and return to the fight." In the summer of 1902, he stuffed his pockets with illegal literature, climbed into a peasant's hay cart, and vanished into the night. At the last moment, needing a false name for his forged passport, he scribbled down the first that came to mind, Trotsky, the name of his former jailer in Odessa. The irony pleased him. He would carry his prison with him as he walked free. The underground network guided him westward through safe houses and coded messages. In Samara, revolutionaries told him Lenin wanted him in London immediately. The old Iskra group, Plekhanov, Zasulich, Axelrod, along with the younger Lenin and Martov, were building something new. They needed writers, organizers, people who could think and act. They needed him. One October morning, he stood outside a modest London flat and knocked loudly on what he'd later call the door of history. Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife, opened it with delight. "The pen has arrived," she announced. Lenin, still in bed, immediately wanted to talk. For hours they discussed Russia, revolution, the party that must be built. The older man was captivated by this young exile who'd arrived like a comet from Siberia. He was plunged into the center of Russian Marxism abroad. They treated him as their Benjamin, their youngest and most promising. Plekhanov alone disliked him on sight, perhaps recognizing a future rival in this confident young man who wrote with such dangerous fluency. Lenin wanted to add him to Iskra's editorial board as a seventh member, to break the constant deadlocks between old and young. Everyone agreed except Plekhanov, whose veto poisoned the atmosphere with an argument that would soon split the movement entirely. For now, though, Trotsky worked 18-hour days, writing, speaking, traveling between exile colonies across Europe. He gave lectures in Paris, Brussels, Liège, anywhere Russians gathered to dream of revolution. His reputation grew with each thundering speech. At 23, he was already being called the young eagle of the revolution. He couldn't know that within a year, at the Second Party Congress, the movement would tear itself apart, that Lenin and Martov, now close as brothers, would become mortal enemies, that he himself would spend 14 years opposing the very man who'd welcomed him so warmly to London. For now, there was only the work, the cause, the absolute certainty that history was accelerating toward its appointment with revolution. Chapter 4: The Schism of 1903. The Second Congress of Russian Social Democrats opened in Brussels in July 1903, then moved to London when Belgian police grew nervous. It was meant to unite the movement. Instead, it shattered it forever. Trotsky arrived, representing the Siberian Union, expecting the Iskra group to act as one. In early debates, he was Lenin's attack dog, savaging the Jewish Bund for wanting autonomy, demolishing the economists for their timid reformism. He argued that party statutes should express the leadership's organized distrust of the members, a phrase that would haunt him later. The real fight was happening backstage. Lenin wanted to streamline Iskra's editorial board from 6 to 3, himself, Martov, and Plekhanov. Out would go the beloved veterans Zasulich and Axelrod, who Lenin considered dead weight. When Trotsky learned of this plan, he was horrified. These were the founders, the pioneers who'd kept the flame alive through decades of exile. Lenin's ruthlessness toward them felt like sacrilege. This personal conflict electrified the debate over paragraph 1 of the party statutes. Such a small difference, Lenin wanted members to personally participate in party organizations. Martov preferred regular cooperation under party guidance. Lenin's version meant a tight core of professional revolutionaries. Martov's opened the door to broader sympathy and support. What seemed like hair-splitting became a chasm. Trotsky threw himself behind Martov with passionate fury. Lenin wasn't building a workers' party, he charged, but a conspiracy of intellectuals who wanted to think for the workers, instead of letting workers think for themselves. The hall erupted. Delegates shouted, pounded tables, hurled accusations. Old friends became instant enemies. Martov's formula won by a slim margin. Then everything shifted. The Bundists walked out over autonomy. The economists left in protest. Suddenly, Lenin had the majority. His faction became the Bolsheviki, the majority ones. Martov's became the Mensheviki, the minority. The names would stick even when the numbers reversed. The Congress ended in chaos and heartbreak. Martov, who'd shared Lenin's Siberian exile, who'd founded Iskra with him, now looked at his old friend as if seeing a stranger. Trotsky was even more dramatic in his denunciations. Lenin was the new Robespierre, he declared, imposing an iron fist on the party. He wanted to create a state of siege, with himself as dictator. For the next 14 years, Trotsky would wage war against Lenin and Bolshevism. He'd write pamphlets warning that Lenin's methods would lead to a situation where the party substitutes itself for the working class. The party organization substitutes itself for the party. The Central Committee substitutes itself for the organization. And finally, a single dictator substitutes himself for the Central Committee. The prophecy was uncannily accurate, but he was describing Stalin's future, not Lenin's. In 1917, Trotsky would join the Bolsheviks and stand at Lenin's side during the October Revolution. History has its ironies. The sharpest critics sometimes become the truest believers once they understand what they're really fighting for and against. Chapter 5, 1905, The Dress Rehearsal. The revolution that erupted in Russia in 1905 found Trotsky living in exile, moving between Geneva cafes and cramped boarding houses. When news reached him that January Sunday, Father Gapon leading thousands of Petersburg workers to the Winter Palace, only to meet the rifles of the Imperial Guard, he understood immediately what had begun. This was no mere protest. The old world was cracking open. He returned to Russia with forged papers that February, slipping through the border controls into Kiev. The country he found was electric with possibility. Strikes were spreading from factory to factory, like fire through dry timber. Students were turning lecture halls into political meetings. Even the traditionally conservative Zemstvos, those local councils of the gentry, were demanding constitutional reform. For months, the liberal bourgeoisie seemed to hold the initiative, their petitions and manifestos setting the political tempo. But Trotsky, writing furiously from underground, saw what they couldn't. or wouldn't see. The Russian middle class was too weak, too tied to foreign capital and aristocratic land ownership to lead any genuine transformation. They wanted reform, yes, but only enough to secure their profits and property. Real change, the kind that would give land to peasants and dignity to workers, terrified them as much as it terrified the Tsar. Through spring and summer, he moved between safe houses, his pamphlets arguing a radical thesis. The working class, barely 2% of the population, would have to lead Russia's democratic revolution. Not the merchants, not the liberal lawyers, but the very people everyone considered too backward, too few, too powerless. History had handed them an impossible task, and they would have to attempt it anyway. October brought the moment of truth. A printer's strike in Moscow became a railway strike, which became a general strike that paralyzed the empire. The Tsar, watching his authority evaporate, issued his October Manifesto, promising constitutional freedoms. That same month, delegates from Petersburg factories gathered in the Technological Institute and formed something unprecedented, a Soviet of Workers' Deputies, an elected council that would coordinate the strike and, perhaps, something more. Trotsky arrived in the capital just as the Soviet was finding its voice. At 26, younger than most delegates, he possessed something they desperately needed: the ability to transform their anger and hope into words that rang like hammers on anvil. Within days, he was writing the Soviet's appeals, its resolutions, its proclamations. The Mensheviks claimed him, the Bolsheviks claimed him, but he wrote for both factions without joining either. His only party was the revolution itself. By November, he was chairman. For 50 days, this assembly of workers challenged the autocracy's right to rule. They weren't just organizing strikes anymore. They were issuing their own laws, establishing their own militia, creating what Trotsky would later call an embryo of revolutionary government. The Soviet decreed an 8-hour workday. Factory owners who resisted found their workers simply leaving after 8 hours, enforcing the decree themselves. The government watched, paralyzed. As this alternative power center grew, ministers debated whether to negotiate or crush it, while the Soviet expanded its authority day by day. Trotsky understood they were racing against time. The revolution needed to spread beyond Petersburg, needed to win over the army, needed to arm the workers, but the momentum was already slowing. The liberals, frightened by the Soviets' radicalism, were making peace with the regime. It was during these feverish weeks that he developed, alongside a brilliant expatriate named Parvus, his theory of permanent revolution. They were editing a newspaper called Nachalo, the beginning, writing sometimes till dawn about what they were witnessing. The idea was startling in its logic. Russia's workers, having started the bourgeois revolution, wouldn't stop there. They couldn't. Once they held power, they'd be forced by their own needs, for bread, for land, for dignity, to begin socialist transformation. But Russia alone couldn't sustain such a transformation. A socialist revolution in backward Russia would need the advanced countries of Europe to follow suit. The revolution would have to become permanent in two senses: continuous within Russia, international in scope. It was a gamble on history's grandest scale. December brought the end. The government, having recovered its nerve, arrested the entire Soviet leadership. 300 delegates were seized in a single day. At his trial the following year, Trotsky turned the courtroom into his platform. His speech, published in underground editions across the empire, was a prophecy and a promise. The revolution had been defeated, yes, but it was merely the first act. The real drama was still to come. Sentenced to lifelong Siberian exile, he escaped again, this time traveling by reindeer sleigh across the frozen Arctic, disguised as a wealthy merchant studying folklore. The 1905 revolution had failed, but it had revealed something crucial. For 50 days, workers had governed themselves. They had created the institutional form, the Soviet, that would return 12 years later to finish what they'd started. The dress rehearsal was over. The real performance would shake the world. Chapter 6: Permanent Revolution and the Doldrums. Following his escape from Siberia in 1907, Trotsky settled in Vienna. For 7 years, the Austrian capital became his home, a period he called the doldrums of reaction. Russia had retreated into darkness after 1905. The revolutionaries were scattered, imprisoned, or dead. From his apartment near the Schönbrunn Palace, he tried to hold together what remained of the movement through sheer force of will. He stood apart from both Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, convinced he could reunite them. His newspaper, Pravda, The Truth, was printed on cheap paper and smuggled into Russia, hidden in double-bottomed suitcases. Lenin dismissed these unity efforts with contempt. Trotsky was a meddler, he said, an obstacle to building a real revolutionary party. The feeling was mutual. Trotsky saw Lenin as a splitter, a man who'd rather rule over a sect than unite a movement. 1, 5, but if these were years of political isolation, they were also years of tremendous intellectual growth. He fully developed his theory of permanent revolution, the idea that had crystallized during 1905. Russia's working class would have to lead the democratic revolution. Once in power, they couldn't stop at democratic measures. They'd be forced by their own position to begin socialist transformation. But backward Russia couldn't complete this transformation alone. The revolution would have to spread westward or perish. Vienna's Central Café became his second home. Here gathered the Austro-Marxists, Victor Adler, Otto Bauer, Karl Renner, brilliant men who wrote treatises on the national question while the empire crumbled around them. Trotsky admired their erudition but was repelled by their pessimism. They'd turned Marxism into an academic exercise, revolution into a distant dream. He immersed himself in European culture, attending the opera, visiting museums, reading everything from French novels to German philosophy. This Western exposure deepened the gulf between him and the underground revolutionaries in Russia. He saw Russian backwardness not as something to romanticize, but as a handicap to overcome. In a powerful 1912 essay, he diagnosed the Russian intelligentsia's tragedy. Unlike Western intellectuals who grew from organic social roots, guilds, universities, municipalities, Russian intellectuals were suspended in air. They had to speak for social forces that barely existed. This produced their characteristic diseases: fanaticism in ideas, ruthless self-limitation, constant watching over their own purity. They were generals without armies, prophets without congregations. He was describing himself, though he didn't see it. By 1914, he was famous across European socialism, a brilliant journalist, a theorist of revolution, a speaker who could make crowds weep or roar. But within his own movement, he commanded no organization, led no faction. He was a voice without a party, certain that history would eventually prove him right. When war exploded across Europe that August, scattering the comfortable world of Viennese cafes and socialist congresses, he would discover that being right wasn't enough. Revolution needed more than brilliant theories. It needed what Lenin had been patiently building while Trotsky wrote manifestos in Vienna, an organized force ready to seize the moment when it came. Chapter 7: War and the International. The outbreak of war in August 1914 shattered European socialism overnight. The German Social Democrats, who'd pledged to oppose any imperialist war, voted for war credits. French socialists rallied to the tricolor, the Second International. That proud federation of workers' parties collapsed like a house of cards. Trotsky, watching from Vienna, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He fled Austria as an enemy alien, reaching neutral Switzerland with little more than his manuscripts. There he wrote War and the International, a furious denunciation of the parties that had betrayed everything. The German Social Democrats had been mother and teacher to every Russian socialist. Now they were sending workers to kill other workers for the glory of the Kaiser. The war, he argued, was capitalism revolting against its own limits, productive forces bursting the boundaries of nation-states. Only revolution could end it. By late 1914, he'd moved to Paris. Together with Martov, his old adversary turned ally, in opposition to the war, they published Naše Slovo, Our Word, a tiny daily paper, 4 pages on good days. It became the voice of Russian internationalists who refused to choose sides in the slaughter. German courts sentenced him in absentia for insulting the Kaiser. French patriots accused him of being a German agent. He belonged nowhere except to the future. September 1915 brought a glimmer of hope. In the Swiss village of Zimmerwald, 38 socialists from across Europe gathered in secret. The delegates could fit in 4 carriages, all that remained of the International. Trotsky drafted the conference manifesto, a document that had to satisfy revolutionaries and pacifists, radicals and moderates. Despite its compromises, it rang with defiance. Proletarians, across frontiers, across the bleeding battlefields, across the ruined cities and villages, proletarians of all countries, unite. The French government's patience ran out in 1916. The Tsarist embassy wanted him gone. The French police wanted him silenced. They gave him 24 hours to leave the country. Spain detained him briefly, a farcical imprisonment where guards didn't know whether he was a dangerous revolutionary or a distinguished journalist. Finally, he sailed for New York. For 10 weeks in early 1917, he lived in the Bronx, riding the subway to the offices of Novy Mir, New World, a Russian socialist paper. He worked alongside Bukharin and Alexandra Kollontai, writing about American capitalism while longing for European revolution. The city fascinated him, its energy, its contradictions, its skyscrapers reaching toward a future that might never come if the war continued. Then, in a shabby print shop on the Lower East Side, surrounded by the smell of ink and the clatter of machinery, he received the telegram that changed everything. Revolution in Petrograd. The Tsar had abdicated. Russia was free. He booked passage immediately, but the British intercepted his ship at Halifax. For a month they held him in a prisoner of war camp, this dangerous agitator heading toward revolution. When the Petrograd Soviet demanded his release, they had no choice. The door of history had opened again. Chapter 8. The Prophet Armed. Freed from his Canadian detention by demands from the Petrograd Soviet, Trotsky reached Russia on May 4, 1917. The capital was schizophrenic, with dual power, the provisional government claiming authority, while the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies held real strength. Ministers issued decrees that no one followed. The Soviets' orders were obeyed instantly. Russia had 2 governments, and everyone knew only one would survive. Trotsky immediately declared that only the Soviets could lead the revolution forward. He took leadership of the Mezreyantsy, the interborough organization, several thousand revolutionaries who stood between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. His platform was the Cirque Modern, a massive amphitheater where he spoke almost nightly to crowds that packed every seat and aisle. Workers came straight from factories, soldiers from barracks, their faces hungry for words that explained their world. In July, he formally joined the Bolsheviks just as the government cracked down following the failed July Days uprising. They accused him, like Lenin, of being a German agent, that eternal charge against revolutionaries who oppose war. He spent 40 days in Kresty prison, writing, thinking, preparing. When General Kornilov attempted his coup in August, the panicked government had to release the Bolsheviks to defend the capital. The prisoners became the saviors. Released in early September, he was immediately elected president of the Petrograd Soviet. From that moment, he was the public face of the coming insurrection, while Lenin remained in hiding. Every day at the Smolny Institute, he spoke to delegates, sailors, soldiers, binding them to the revolution with words that seemed to make history tangible. As head of the Military Revolutionary Committee, he planned the seizure of power with meticulous care. He opposed Lenin's impatience. Lenin wanted the party to seize power immediately, in its own name. Trotsky insisted they wait for the All-Russian Congress of Soviets to take power in the Soviets' name, giving the revolution democratic legitimacy. It was a brilliant stroke. Revolution not as coup, but as transfer of authority from one democratic body to another. October 25th came with almost anticlimactic ease. The Winter Palace fell after desultory resistance. Ministers were arrested while still debating what to do. As the insurrection reached its climax, the Second Congress of Soviets opened at Smolny. The hall shook with the sound of artillery across the river. Mensheviks and social revolutionaries rose to leave in protest, declaring the Bolshevik action a crime against democracy. Trotsky stood at the rostrum, his voice cutting through their protests like a blade through silk. "You are pitiful, isolated individuals," he told them. "You are bankrupts. Your role is played out. Go where you belong from now on, into the dustbin of history." The phrase would echo through decades. They walked out into the night and irrelevance, while inside the Congress voted to transfer all power to the Soviets. At 38, he stood second only to Lenin in the new order. The boy from Yanovka had become the prophet armed, holding the revolution's sword. What none of them knew that triumphant night was how quickly victory would turn to siege, how soon they'd be fighting not for world revolution, but for mere survival. Chapter 9. Arming the Republic. In the new Council of People's Commissars, Trotsky first took foreign affairs. His opening move was theatrical, publishing the Tsarist secret treaties, exposing how the Allies had carved up the world in advance. But foreign affairs meant little when white armies were forming on every frontier. In March 1918, Lenin appointed him Commissar of War. The assignment seemed impossible. Build an army from nothing, while the country collapsed into civil war. The old army had dissolved. Soldiers had voted with their feet, walking home from the trenches, taking their rifles, leaving generals to command empty headquarters. Revolutionary committees wanted partisan bands, not regular forces. The very idea of discipline was counter-revolutionary, they said. Trotsky knew better. Partisan enthusiasm couldn't defeat professional armies backed by 14 foreign powers. He established his headquarters on an armoured train, a moving fortress that became legendary for 2.5 years. It would cover 65,000 miles, appearing wherever the front was breaking. The train carried a printing press, telegraph station, electric power station, library, garage with cars and trucks, even an aeroplane for reconnaissance. It was a government on wheels, racing between crises. His most controversial decision was recruiting 50,000 former Tsarist officers, the military specialists. The party erupted. These were class enemies, the same officers who'd shot workers in 1905. Add Tsaritsyn, the future, Stalingrad, Voroshilov, and Stalin openly defied his orders, executing officers Trotsky had appointed. He responded by threatening to court-martial them both. To ensure loyalty, he created the system of political commissars, communists, assigned to watch every officer countersign every order. When that wasn't enough, he took hostages from officers' families. Desertion meant their execution. It was brutal, but the arithmetic was simple. Without trained commanders, the revolution would drown in its own blood. 1.5. At Sviazhsk in August 1918 came the first real test. The Whites had taken Kazan. The Red forces were panicking, entire regiments fleeing. Trotsky arrived in his train to find chaos. He gathered the scattered units, had deserters shot in front of their comrades, promoted brave soldiers on the spot. When one regiment abandoned positions, he placed the commissar and commander before a tribunal and had them executed within the hour. Word spread through the ranks. The commissar of war had arrived, and with him iron discipline. Within days, the panic turned to determination. They retook Kazan, captured the White Army's gold reserves, proved the Reds could win. From nothing, he was forging an army of 3 million, transforming workers and peasants into soldiers through a mixture of revolutionary conviction and terrible necessity. By 1920, they defeated Kolchak in Siberia, Denikin in the south, Udenish outside Petrograd. The workers' and peasants' Red Army had won, but the methods used, terror, hostages, mass conscription, had changed the revolution's character. The party that had promised liberation now ruled through force. Trotsky had saved the revolution by militarizing it. The sword he'd forged would one day be turned against him. Chapter 10. Revolution and Conquest. The Brest-Litovsk negotiations in early 1918 showed the revolution's first impossible choice. Trotsky led the Soviet delegation, turning the peace talks into revolutionary theater, facing German and Austrian diplomats across polished tables. He spoke not to them, but through them, addressing German workers over their generals' heads. He proclaimed a formula that stunned everyone: neither war nor peace. Russia would stop fighting but refuse to sign an annexationist treaty. It was a magnificent gamble. German revolution seemed days away. Strikes were spreading through Berlin and Vienna. Why sign away half of European Russia when history itself was about to make all treaties meaningless? When the Germans lost patience and resumed their advance, the gamble failed catastrophically. Their armies walked through Russian lines like doors left open. The party tore itself apart. Lenin demanded they sign the humiliating peace to buy breathing space. The left communists, led by Bukharin, wanted revolutionary war. Better to die fighting than surrender. Trotsky held the deciding vote. For days he wavered between principles and reality. Finally, he abstained, letting Lenin's position win by 1 vote. They signed the treaty, losing Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland, 1/3 of Russia's population, gone. The dilemma returned in 1920 during the Polish War. After driving Pilsudski's invading armies from Ukraine, the Red Army stood at Poland's borders. Lenin and most of the Politburo wanted to march on Warsaw, export the revolution on bayonets, link up with German communists, spread the fire westward. Trotsky stood almost alone in opposition. Polish workers would see the Red Army not as liberators, but as Russian conquerors, he argued. Revolution couldn't be imposed from outside. It had to grow from within, or it would create nationalism, not socialism. The majority overruled him. The Red Army marched toward Warsaw, and Trotsky watched his prediction unfold. Polish workers rallied to their flag, not their class. The miracle on the Vistula saw the Red Army routed, thousands killed or captured. These defeats forced terrible realizations. The European Revolution wasn't coming. Soviet Russia stood alone, surrounded by hostile powers. The working class that had made the revolution was decimated by civil war. Cities were empty, factories silent. They ruled a wasteland in the name of a proletariat that barely existed anymore. Then came Kronstadt in March 1921. The sailors of the naval fortress, heroes of October, rose against Bolshevik rule. They demanded free elections to the Soviets, freedom of speech, release of socialist political prisoners. These were men who'd helped storm the Winter Palace. Now they called the Bolsheviks traitors to the revolution. Trotsky issued the ultimatum: surrender or face assault across the ice. When they refused, he ordered the attack. Red Army units, led by delegates from the Party Congress, stormed the fortress. Hundreds died on both sides. The Kronstadt sailors fought, crying, "Long live the revolution!" as they fell. It was the revolution devouring its own children, the surgeon cutting out healthy tissue to save a dying patient. Necessary, Trotsky said, but something essential died on that ice. Chapter 11. The Anathema. The Civil War ended in 1921 with victory over a graveyard. Russia was broken. The working class that supposedly ruled had fled starving cities for the countryside. Lenin admitted the proletariat had become declassed, dispersed, demoralized. The party that once led a living movement now ruled by default over exhaustion. This was the crisis beneath everything. Legitimacy draining away like blood from a wound. Lenin's health began failing in 1922. The first stroke came that May, then another in December. As he weakened, a triumvirate formed: Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev, united by one goal: stop Trotsky from succeeding Lenin. Stalin, newly appointed General Secretary, worked the apparatus like a machine, placing his people in every key position. What seemed like boring administrative work was actually a slow coup. From his sickbed, Lenin watched with growing alarm. Stalin's handling of Georgia, bullying, threats, great Russian chauvinism, revealed the bureaucracy's rot. In late 1922, Lenin proposed a bloc with Trotsky against Stalin and the bureaucratic degeneration. He entrusted Trotsky with defending their shared positions on foreign trade, monopoly, and the national question. Then came Lenin's testament, dictated in December, about Stalin. Having become General Secretary, he has concentrated boundless authority in his hands, and I am not sure he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. About Trotsky, distinguished not only by outstanding ability, personally perhaps the most capable man in the present Central Committee, but he has displayed excessive self-assurance and excessive preoccupation with the purely administrative side of work. Days later, Lenin added his bombshell postscript: Stalin is too rude, and this defect becomes intolerable in a General Secretary. I suggest, comrades, think about a way of removing Stalin from that post. But just as this political weapon was ready, Lenin suffered his final stroke in March 1923. He would linger speechless until January 1924, a living ghost, while others fought over his inheritance. Trotsky made his fatal error. He thought it dishonorable to attack rivals while Lenin lay dying. He underestimated Stalin completely, this grey blur, this mediocrity, this man with no ideas of his own. At the 12th Congress in April 1923, Trotsky kept silent about Lenin's testament, honoring a gentleman's agreement with his enemies. The Triumvirs, saved from destruction, consolidated their grip. When Lenin died in January 1924, Stalin deceived Trotsky about the funeral date. Trotsky remained in the Caucasus, recuperating from mysterious fevers that struck at convenient moments. His absence from Lenin's funeral was used against him for years. The testament was read to select delegates at the 13th Congress that May, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, who'd once called for Stalin's blood, now saved him, arguing he'd learned his lessons. By January 1925, they'd forced Trotsky from his last real position, Commissar of War. The man who'd built the Red Army, who'd stood beside Lenin in October, was being erased from history. While history was still warm, the revolution's sword had been taken from his hand. All that remained was his pen, and they were coming for that too. Chapter 12. The Decisive Contest. 2-0. With Lenin permanently gone, the struggle erupted into the open in autumn 1923. Russia faced the scissors crisis, industrial prices soaring while agricultural prices collapsed, threatening to snap the alliance between workers and peasants. The Triumvirate had no answers, just slogans. In October, 46 prominent Bolsheviks issued a declaration denouncing economic mismanagement and the suffocation of party democracy. This was the birth of the left opposition. Trotsky joined immediately, writing articles that became the pamphlet The New Course. He attacked the secretarial bureaucracy that was replacing debate with fear. The party's sacred right to think was being strangled by appointed officials who owed everything to Stalin's apparatus. He appealed to the youth to challenge the ossifying old guard, warning that bureaucratism was a social phenomenon rooted in the gulf between the party and the masses it claimed to represent. The opposition won debates in Moscow party cells. Workers and students rallied to their arguments, but the apparatus controlled what mattered, selecting delegates to conferences, while Trotsky lay ill with mysterious fevers that struck whenever crucial votes approached. The Triumvirate mobilized their machine. The January 1924 party conference condemned the opposition for petty bourgeois deviation from Leninism. Later that year, Trotsky published Lessons of October, analyzing the 1917 revolution. He highlighted an awkward fact. Zinoviev and Kamenev had opposed Lenin's call for insurrection, had even published their opposition in a non-party newspaper. The Triumvirate exploded. They launched a literary campaign against Trotskyism, rewriting history to show Trotsky had always fought Lenin, had always been an enemy. Every article he'd written, every disagreement before 1917, was exhumed and weaponized. They invented quotations, distorted positions, created a mythical anti-Leninist that bore no resemblance to reality. The big lie, repeated often enough, becomes truth. Party members who'd never read Trotsky's actual works learned to hate this fictional creation. Meanwhile, Stalin unveiled his theory of socialism in one country. Russia could build complete socialism alone without international revolution. It was a comforting lie for an exhausted nation, but it meant abandoning everything they'd fought for. The revolution had always been international, or it was nothing. Now Stalin offered them permission to stop waiting for a world that wouldn't come. The Triumvirate itself was splitting. Zinoviev and Kamenev, controlling Leningrad, grew alarmed at Stalin's accumulating power and the rightward drift under Bukharin's influence. The kulaks were growing rich, while workers' wages stagnated. The revolution was becoming its opposite, a state where bureaucrats ruled in the name of a working class that had no voice. By April 1926, the impossible happened. Zinoviev and Kamenev came to Trotsky seeking alliance. They confessed everything. The anti-Trotsky campaign had been a fraud, a maneuver for power. Stalin had been their tool, but the tool had become the master. The roots of evil, Kamenev whispered, was that party and state had merged completely. Stalin would subordinate everything to his lust for power. The joint opposition was born from this confession, former enemies united against a greater threat. But it was already too late. Stalin controlled the machinery that controlled the party, that controlled the state. Chapter 13. The Prophet Outcast. After losing the War Commissariat, Trotsky retreated into minor economic posts. He wrote about industrial planning, electrical development, the scientific organization of labor. His book, Where is Britain Going?, predicted the empire's decline and America's rise with uncanny precision. He was a prophet studying the future while his enemies destroyed his past, erasing him from photographs, from history books, from memory itself. The joint opposition fought for 18 months against impossible odds. Their platform demanded rapid industrialization, financed by taxing kulaks, revival of party democracy, rejection of socialism in one country. Every attempt to reach party members met systematic sabotage. Their meetings were broken up by whistling, shouting gangs. Their documents were confiscated. Their supporters fired from jobs, expelled from schools. The Chinese Revolution of 1925 became their greatest battle. Stalin forced Chinese communists to subordinate themselves to Chiang Kai-shek's Kuomintang, promising this would protect them. Trotsky warned it was suicide. Chiang would turn on them the moment he felt strong enough. In April 1927, his prophecy came true. Chiang massacred the Shanghai communists, thousands dead in days. Stalin suppressed news of the massacre while it was happening. On August 1st, 1927, Trotsky delivered his last great speech to the Central Committee. Constant interruptions, howls of rage, demands he be silenced. He pressed on. The Stalinist group would soon use against the opposition all the methods the class enemy used against Bolsheviks. They'd expelled comrades who'd made 3 revolutions. Not a single oppositionist would renounce his duty to fight for the party's correct course, even during war. For the socialist fatherland, yes. For Stalin's course, no. October brought expulsion from the Central Committee. On the revolution's 10th anniversary, the opposition tried staging street demonstrations. Stalin's police broke them up, arrested hundreds. Supporters who'd hung Trotsky's portrait in windows were beaten. A week later, he and Zinoviev were expelled from the party itself. Zinoviev cracked almost immediately, begging forgiveness, prostrating himself. Others followed, unable to exist outside the only church they'd known. Trotsky refused to bend. In January 1928, GPU agents dragged him from his Moscow apartment. They put him on a train for Alma-Ata, near the Chinese border, 2,500 miles from Moscow. But exile only transformed his methods. With his son Lyova, he created an underground network reaching thousands of oppositionists scattered across Siberia's vastness. 800 letters in 9 months, political circulars, theoretical essays, all flowing from that dusty town where summer meant 100-degree heat and winter meant wolves in the streets. He was leading a ghost party, connecting the disappeared, maintaining hope among the defeated. Stalin had exiled him to break him. Instead, he'd created a government in internal exile. The year 1928 brought vindication of sorts. Facing grain strikes from kulaks, Stalin panicked and lurched left, adopting the opposition's program of forced industrialization and collectivization. Some oppositionists thought this meant victory. Stalin was implementing their ideas. Trotsky saw clearer. Stalin would carry out their policies, but through bureaucratic brutality, without democracy, creating a caricature of socialism. In January 1929, 29. Stalin had him deported from the Soviet Union entirely. The Prophet was cast out, never to return. Chapter 14. The Hell-Black Night. On January 22nd, 1929, Stalin expelled Trotsky from the Soviet Union forever. GPU agents escorted him to the Turkish border, dumping the revolution's architect like contraband. He arrived in Constantinople in February, settling on Principo, an island in the Sea of Marmara. From this fishing village, he would wage his final campaign against Stalin while the world collapsed into depression and fascism. He believed Stalinism was temporary, a bureaucratic infection that history would cure. So he created the International Left Opposition, not a new party, but a faction to reform the Communist International from within. His weapons were words. On Principo, he wrote his autobiography, My Life, and his masterpiece, the 3-volume history of the Russian Revolution. The Bulletin of the Opposition, published in Russian, was smuggled into the Soviet Union. Each copy passed hand to hand until it fell apart. While he wrote, 2 catastrophes unfolded. Stalin launched forced collectivization, driving millions of peasants from their land, creating famine that killed untold numbers. Simultaneously, the Wall Street crash triggered global depression, throwing millions into unemployment, desperation, fury. In Germany, the Nazis rose from the margins to become the second largest party by 1930. Trotsky saw what was coming with terrible clarity. From 1930 onward, he bombarded the German communists with warnings: unite with the Social Democrats, form a common front against Hitler, or face annihilation. The German party was the strongest outside Russia. 500,000 members, millions of voters. Together with the Social Democrats, they could stop the Nazis cold. But Stalin's Comintern had entered its ultra-left phase. Social Democrats were social fascists, they declared, no different from Nazis. Some even argued Hitler's victory would accelerate revolution. After Hitler, our turn. Trotsky responded with savage contempt. Should fascism come to power, he wrote, it will ride over your skulls and spines like a terrific tank. Make haste, German communists. You have very little time left. January 1933. Hitler became Chancellor. Within weeks, the mighty German labor movement was destroyed without firing a shot. Trade unions disbanded, parties outlawed, leaders in concentration camps. The Comintern that had refused to fight now couldn't even protest. For Trotsky, this was the end. The Third International was dead. Time to build the Fourth. That same month, personal tragedy struck. His daughter Zina, stranded in Berlin, stripped of Soviet citizenship, separated from her child, suffering from tuberculosis and depression, took her own life. She'd written begging him to help, but he had no power, no money, no influence. He couldn't even get her a visa. Stalin had murdered her as surely as if he'd pulled the trigger. The hell-black night was descending. In Russia, former oppositionists were disappearing into camps. His supporters, his friends, his comrades from 3 revolutions, vanishing into the Gulag archipelago. His other daughter, Nina, had died of tuberculosis in 1928. His son, Sergei, who'd stayed out of politics, would be arrested and shot. The massacre of a generation was beginning, and he could only watch from his island, writing prophecies no one would hear until too late. Chapter 15. A Planet Without a Visa. With Hitler consolidating power and the Comintern dead in his eyes, Trotsky sought to leave Turkey for Europe's center. In July 1933, France's radical government granted him a visa, an act of principle that stunned a continent sliding toward fascism. He settled near Royan, then Barbizon, beginning his monumental biography of Lenin. But political silence was impossible when history was accelerating toward catastrophe. The Stavisky affair exploded in February 1934, a corruption scandal that brought fascist mobs into Paris streets. Trotsky saw the pattern. Democracies collapse, following the same script from Rome to Berlin. He urged his French followers to enter the Socialist Party, win over its ranks from within. This French turn outraged purists who wanted revolutionary parties kept pure, even if that meant keeping them microscopic. A secretary's traffic violation led police to his hideout. The press campaign started immediately. Stalinist papers calling him a fascist agent, fascist papers calling him a Jewish Bolshevik terrorist. He wrote in his diary about being a magnificent target for every journalist, his exceptional life offering rich material for speculation and lies. The reader remains perplexed, he noted. Why such hatred? He must have given cause. Hounded by police, he and Natalia fled to remote alpine villages, moving constantly, cut off from supporters. Meanwhile, in December 1934, Kirov was assassinated in Leningrad. Stalin's response was swift. Mass arrests, executions, the beginning of what would become the Great Terror. From his alpine isolation, Trotsky recognized the pattern instantly. Stalin was preparing the greatest political forgery in world history. In June 1935, France expelled him. Pierre Laval needed Stalin's alliance against Hitler more than he needed democratic principles. Norway's Labour government offered asylum, socialists giving refuge to socialism's prophet. But when the first Moscow show trial opened in August 1936, with Zinoviev and Kamenev confessing to being Trotsky's terrorist agents, Norway buckled under Soviet pressure. They placed him under house arrest, forbade him from writing about current events, stationed police around his house. A Labour government was silencing the man who'd created the Red Army while his former comrades were being tortured into confessing impossible crimes. They desperately sought somewhere to deport him. Every democracy refused. America, Britain, France, all closed their doors. Only Mexico offered sanctuary. President Lázaro Cárdenas, implementing land reform and nationalizing oil, understood what it meant to stand against powerful enemies. In January 1937, Trotsky arrived in Mexico as the second Moscow trial unfolded, with wilder accusations, wrecking, sabotage, poisoning workers, planning to restore capitalism. He knew his only weapon was truth against an empire of lies. He accepted John Dewey's proposal for an international commission to investigate the charges. In Diego Rivera's Blue House in Coyoacán, he would put Stalin on trial before world opinion. The hunter had given his prey one last platform. It would be Trotsky's final great performance, defending not just himself, but historical truth itself against totalitarian falsification. Chapter 16. The Counter-Trial in Coyoacán. The Dewey Commission convened in April 1937 in Diego Rivera's Blue House. For 13 sessions, Trotsky stood before international observers. John Dewey, the celebrated philosopher, leading journalists, academics, skeptics. They came to test the Moscow trial's fantastic claims that Trotsky had plotted with Hitler, that he'd organized sabotage from 4,000 miles away, that he'd met with defendants in hotels that didn't exist on dates he could prove he was elsewhere. For nearly a week, he submitted to exhaustive cross-examination. Every aspect of his life, his writings, his movements, was scrutinized. He produced mountains of evidence, letters, telegrams, passport stamps, newspaper reports. The alleged meeting in Copenhagen's Hotel Bristol. The hotel had been demolished years before. The secret flight to Oslo. Norwegian authorities confirmed he'd never entered their country. Each lie collapsed under documentation's weight. His closing statement ran 5.5 hours. Not a plea for mercy, but a dissection of Stalin's system. The frame-ups weren't madness, but method. Stalin needed to destroy every alternative, every memory of what the revolution had meant. The old Bolsheviks had to confess, to validate their own executions. Terror required legitimacy, and legitimacy required the victims' participation in their own destruction. He ended not with personal defense, but revolutionary affirmation. The experience of my life, in which there has been no lack of success or failure, has not destroyed my faith in the clear, bright future of mankind. This faith in reason, in truth, in human solidarity, which at 18 I took into the workers' quarters, I have preserved fully and completely. The Commission's verdict came months later. Not guilty, complete vindication before world opinion. But Stalin didn't recognize world opinion. February 1938 brought the third Moscow trial. Bukharin, Rykov, the right opposition's leaders. More baroque confessions, more impossible crimes. Then came devastating personal news. His son, Lyova, his closest collaborator, had died mysteriously in a Paris hospital after routine surgery. The doctors couldn't explain the sudden complications. Trotsky had no doubt the GPU had murdered his son. Lyova had been everything: secretary, organizer, link to supporters worldwide. More than that, he'd been the last family member actively carrying on the fight. Sergei, his other son, had already disappeared into Stalin's camps. Nina was dead. Zina was dead. Now Lyova. The noose was tightening around those who remained. September 1938. Despite everything, Trotsky proclaimed the Fourth International's founding, 40 delegates meeting secretly near Paris, representing groups that could fit in a single room. Against Stalin's empire, Hitler's armies, and capitalism's crisis, this handful declared themselves history's vanguard. It was either sublime faith or sublime madness. He moved to a new house on Avenida Vienna, transforming it into a fortress. Brick walls topped with electric wires, steel doors, guards with machine guns. He knew they were coming. The only questions were when and how. He continued writing articles, letters, his biography of Stalin, racing against time. Every page might be his last, every word written in death's shadow. Chapter 17. The Hell-Black Night and the Ice Axe. On May 24th, 1940, 20 men with machine guns stormed the fortress on Avenida Vienna. Led by the painter Siqueiros, they riddled Trotsky's bedroom with 300 bullets. He and Natalia survived by throwing themselves beneath their bed, lying still as plaster rained down. Their grandson's room was also sprayed with gunfire. Miraculously, no one died. Stalin has failed this time, Trotsky told reporters the next morning, but he knew another attempt would come. The final assassin was already inside. For months, Ramon Mercader, posing as Jacques Monard, then Frank Jackson, had been courting a trusted American supporter, a businessman interested in politics, he said, apolitical but sympathetic. He brought chocolates for Natalia, played with the rabbits in the garden, gradually became part of the household's routine. No one suspected this awkward young man who complained about his girlfriend's politics. Through spring and summer 1940, Trotsky worked feverishly on his Stalin biography, analyzing the man who'd destroyed the revolution. He also fought his last theoretical battle with American supporters over the Soviet Union's nature. Despite everything, the purges, the Hitler Pact, the invasion of Finland, he insisted it remained a degenerated workers' state. Nationalized property, October's conquest, survived. In war between the USSR and imperialism, revolutionaries must defend the Soviet Union, however critically. August 20th, late afternoon, Jackson arrived, asking Trotsky to review an article he'd written. Nothing unusual. He'd done this before. Trotsky led him to his study, sat at his desk, began reading. The article was gibberish, but Trotsky continued, perhaps from politeness. Jackson stood behind him, wearing a raincoat despite the warm day. Inside the coat, an ice axe stolen from a mountaineering shop. The blow came from behind, aimed at splitting the skull, but Jackson, nervous, bungled it. The axe went in 3 inches, but at an angle. Trotsky let out what witnesses described as a long, terrible cry, an ah that seemed to last forever. He threw himself at his assassin, bit his hand, prevented a second blow. Guards rushed in, found Trotsky standing, blood streaming down his face, still fighting. "Don't kill him," Trotsky said about Jackson. "He has a story to tell. Even dying, he thought like a historian." They carried him to his bed. Natalia held him as doctors worked futilely. His mind remained clear almost to the end. "I am close to death from the blow of a political assassin," he dictated. "Please say to our friends, I am sure of the victory of the Fourth International. Go forward." He died the next evening, August 21st, 1940. His testament, written months earlier, provided his epitaph. "Life is beautiful," he'd written. "Let future generations cleanse it of all evil, oppression, and violence, and enjoy it to the full." The boy from Yanovka, who'd wanted only to win arguments, had died believing in humanity's future, even as humanity destroyed itself in the war he'd predicted. The prophet was silenced, but his prophecies remained, waiting for history to prove them right or wrong. Epilogue: The Prophet's Afterlife. Trotsky died believing history would absolve him. Stalin had erased him from photographs, textbooks, memory itself. For decades after his death, mentioning his name in the Soviet Union meant imprisonment or worse. Yet today, when Stalin's empire has crumbled and his statues lie toppled, Trotsky remains vibrantly controversial, studied, debated, invoked by movements from Mexico City to Mumbai. His immediate predictions proved wrong. The Fourth International never became the mass force he envisioned. The Soviet Union survived another 50 years without the political revolution he insisted was necessary. Capitalism weathered the crisis he thought would destroy it, but his deeper insights endure with uncomfortable relevance. His theory of uneven and combined development, originally formulated to explain Russia's peculiar path, has undergone an academic renaissance. Scholars such as Justin Rosenberg have generalized it into a theory of international relations, while younger theorists like Felix Buchwald apply it to understanding how international trade shaped Latin America's 19th century economic divergence. The theory's central insight is that societies do not pass through uniform stages of development. Instead, they follow uneven trajectories, forcibly combining archaic and modern elements into a volatile synthesis with destabilizing social and political consequences. Trotsky saw this dynamic as a universal law of the capitalist world system, not a feature exclusive to so-called backward societies. Contemporary China, where cutting-edge technology coexists with a vast peasantry, exemplifies a pattern of development and contradiction that would have fascinated him. He understood, before most, how revolutionary movements could devour themselves. His analysis of bureaucratic degeneration, how a party substitutes for a class, a central committee for the party, and finally a single leader for all. Reads like prophecy, not just of Stalin, but of revolutionary failures from China to Cuba. He saw how socialism's banner could mask new forms of oppression. His theory of permanent revolution describes something we see everywhere today: how democratic movements in developing nations face impossible choices between accepting subordination to global capital or attempting transformations their economies can't sustain alone. The Arab Spring's trajectory from hope to catastrophe would have seemed familiar to him. More than theories, he left a method, the refusal to choose between equally false alternatives. Neither Washington nor Moscow, he insisted, but international socialism. Today's version might be neither neoliberal capitalism nor authoritarian state capitalism, but something yet to be imagined. His intransigence looks less like sectarianism and more like clarity when we see how many compromises led nowhere. His cultural writings reveal another Trotsky, the revolutionary, who insisted that under socialism the average human would rise to the heights of Aristotle, Goethe, Marx. While Stalin promoted socialist realism's dreary conformity, Trotsky defended artistic experimentation, surrealism, the right to create without political dictation. His weaknesses also instruct: his blind spot about his own role in creating the apparatus that Stalin inherited, his militarization of labor, his crushing of Kronstadt. Did these methods make Stalin possible? He never fully reckoned with this question. Revolutionary violence, even when necessary, transforms those who wield it. Today, as democracy retreats globally, as inequality reaches historic peaks, as climate crisis demands transformations capitalism seems incapable of making, Trotsky's ghost haunts us, not with answers, but with questions. How does radical change happen? Who makes it? Can it avoid devouring itself? He remains important not because he was right, but because he faced these problems without illusion, without hope, except in humanity's capacity to transcend its limits.